Hello and welcome to Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and it is my pleasure today to welcome Anurag Shukla. Anurag is a policy expert, but he's also an extremely focused person on Indian education. And Anurag and I are going to do a series on education in India, how it's evolved since colonial times as well as post-colonial Marxist era education. As for Anurag, he has a master's in development from Azim Premji University and MPhil in education from the Central Institute of Education of the University of Delhi, and is pursuing the doctoral program at IIM Ahmedabad, which is where he is situated right now.
Yeah.
And he's previously been associated with organizations like Pratham, Azim Premji Foundation, Center for Advocacy and Research, the Times Group, Business Standard, and then he's gone on to start his own ventures. He's the co-founder of Localism. And Anurag, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Namaste and welcome to
My
A
pleasure.
Question. So, Anurag, would you like to tell the audience a little bit about localism? It's a very great idea, to have local input into policy making, etc. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about the venture
Yes.
before we move on to education?
Yeah. So it was during the COVID. I think it was the first wave of COVID when we started this organization, and this came from the idea that so as a responsible member of society, we should do something about the situation. And so along with my co-founders, and all of us came from actually social sector background, and we had actually worked with communities in many places in many states in India. So we thought that why not start something right now? And we had been actually thinking about this program for starting this organization for a very long time. So then we decided that this is the right time, and also there was this like kind of dilemma that whether we should do something individually or do something through organization with a philosophy behind it. So then we decided that there should be a philosophy, there should be values attached to whatever we are going to do, and the values or the philosophy which we found was more suited to our venture, our initiative was this idea of localism, where we talk, where we like kind of talk about the bottom to top approach of policy making. So we feel that the policy is not just located in these think tanks or the organizations in Delhi or in New York, like at the global policy level. So many policies are decided from the New York or places like Geneva, right? and and also making people the real stakeholder of whatever happening to them, right? So you sitting in Delhi, Mumbai, or any other state capital, you deciding the fate of people who are living in a village. So why not also involve those people in this whole process of transformation and change? So then we started this organization in two backward districts of two completely different states, one in Rajasthan, one in Jharkhand, in Jharkhand in Hazaribagh district, and in Rajasthan in Banswara district. And we have been working in an area of reproductive and child health, menstruation, kind of helping out people in accessing public welfare programs. We were partnered with state government of Jharkhand and state government of Rajasthan on their vaccination program as well. So it is going really well, and kind of we're also feeling that this is the right approach, and we should go ahead with it. And now we are talking with many partner organizations and individuals who would like to kind of, if they are interested in our work, then they can, then we can come together and kind of expand it in like other geographical areas as well.
Right.
So
So
this is.
you're targeting tribal areas due to your exposure to social work previously as well?
Yeah, so actually, I stayed in Jharkhand for almost 1 year, and one of my co-founder, he's also from Jharkhand. So we thought that it would be good to start from an area where we have some knowledge about, right?
Right, right.
So we started from Jharkhand, and at the same time we had someone. So one of my co-founders, Suraj, he's with one big international organization these days, and he was leading an organization in Rajasthan for almost 5-6 years. So he had some contacts in Rajasthan as well, in those areas. So I think we found these two areas were most suitable for us to work because we had some prior information on it and we had some local people who could partner with us. So we started from here. So now we are expanding the organization's approach to other states as well. So we are going to start working in Bihar, in West Bengal as well, in partnership with one other organization. So our work is going to be expanded like in next few years. Hopefully, it becomes
Oh,
much
good
bigger.
luck. Good luck. I'm especially excited because Hazaribagh is where a lot of my relatives are as well. It's an ancestral town for me, so I'm very glad that localism is present there. And I suppose this is an approach that deviates from the civilizing mentality that a lot
Yes.
of people bring to the local indigenous populations of these places. Yes.
Yeah. So very interesting. So actually, my MPhil study looked at the structural and symbolic violence on Adivasis, especially in context of language issues in education. So, for example, in Jharkhand, there are more than 32 tribes, and they speak more than 17 languages. And there are studies which show that how 97% of kids who come to government schools, they speak some other language uh, other than Hindi or English in their home environment, right? So language is a big issue, and there is high dropouts among tribal
Right.
children in Jharkhand. And like for example, uh, for a Adivasi kid in Jharkhand, so he might be speaking Kudak, Mundari, Santhali, Pahadia language in his or her home. The language of market is Nagpuriya. The language of school is Hindi. And if he wants to pursue or she wants to pursue higher education, he or she has to speak in English or enroll herself in English medium school. So there are these barriers which exist that kind of prevent or force these people out of education system altogether. So we've always wanted to do something about it, and that's what got us interested in working in these areas. So we are working with Adivasi communities. We are especially with women. We feel that women are the lever which we can use to enter these communities, and if we can actually change or maybe fo- not force some change, but working with communities if they feel that education is important for them, public health is important for them, then working with a woman, the advantage of it is that it changes whole family. So then she goes back to her family, talks about these issues with her husband or parents or other members of the family, and then you can actually see a change happening. So
Well,
this is, yeah.
that's a very very good approach. I think making the actual stakeholders, offer their inputs because honestly, nobody else has more skin in the game than they do, and it's important to have their input when policies are made and ensuring that welfare is delivered as well. So congratulations on the
Thank you.
initiative, and I hope that you connect with governments across the country to make this work and spread really quickly. So Anurag, to begin with, and you've segued really well into the education aspect as well. So what made you interested in education? You've studied a lot, you've educated yourself a lot in terms of education as well. So what makes education such a pivoting point for you in terms of national welfare and well-being?
Yeah. So actually, when I started my career, especially in social sector, it was more from the perspective of public health. So initially I looked at the health issues of Adivasi population in Rajguru Nagar Taluka, Pune district, in near Pune, in Chamarajanagar district, again in Karnataka, and several other places. But then I started realizing that how all of these domains, which we call domains in social sector, health, education, livelihood, they are interconnected. So it's not so, and you cannot really separate them out. You cannot say that, oh, I would only work in education, I won't work in public health. You know? And these are the issues with which many organizations are struggling with. So they are working in one domain and they feel that, oh, nothing is changing. So we also wanted. So I also wanted to take an integrated approach, and also when I went through many research studies and the profiles of many organizations, I realized that how education can actually make a greater change. For example, there are many existing schemes by the central government and the state governments, but people are not aware about it. So if we can go and work with the communities around education, and education is not just what we study in schools
Right.
or in colleges. When we talk about education, it is about even other life skills, socio emotional skills, or just being aware of whatever things are happening around you. So just being like kind of aware of your status in the society, your location in the society. So so we so 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 I started working with many of these committees, and after completing my masters from Ajim University, I worked the Ajim PMG Foundation for a bit, for almost 1 year. And it was in Uttarakhand, working with kids in those like small communities. It like transforming movement for me, and I always kind of loved working with kids, like their smile and always their desire to ask so many questions they have for you. And also if you are good to them, they are really really good to you. Even now I kept getting calls from them that, yeah, what are you doing and how are you doing all. So that was something I really liked doing. And I also started reading around psychology of education, sociology of education, uh, and and some of the thinkers. For example, I could see that why Sri Aurobindo or Swami Vivekananda or other specialists, other modern sages were so much interested in education. Why Tagore went and started Santi Niketan. Why Aurobindo like kind of thought about education as the adhara of everything. And why Swami Vivekananda was so much around that we have to change our society through education, through humanist actions, because they could see that education actually is nothing but so whatever makes us as human being. And it's not and I'm not talking about the colonial education, because all of these individuals were critique, like a staunch critique of colonial education. But
Right.
education which we used to get in our communities before this whole like colonial education came to us, right? So studying these philosophies, uh, kind of reading the texts from these modern sages, working with the community, all of that got me interested in education. And then I kind of went and joined MPhil program at Delhi University, and there again I got a chance to work with many professors and working across many subdomains in education areas. So my attempt was to kind of have a kind of a preliminary understanding of how education works. So that's how I got interested in education, and now I feel that it's a very complex issue, and it's also very like difficult to make any judgment here. So the more I know about education, the more I realize that it is not. For example, it is very difficult to make any decision for anybody sitting in Ahmedabad or sitting in Delhi or any other place. So you have to go and visit people and see that what education can do for them. Right.
So
So this is
decentralized approach to education is sort of going to be the
as well.
best one.
And yes, and also for example, I also worked with many organizations who had very for Marxist organization as well, who had approached like there should be only publicly funded education, no private
Yes.
education at all, right? And I also worked with the organization who were of the approach that there should not be any public funding, uh, only private organizations should be in this space. And now kind of I am finding a middle ground out of it, that we need both publicly funded organizations, publicly funded education, as well as private organizations who have their own ideas to change education and transform the whole education system. So now I'm somewhere at the middle ground, and still
Right.
trying to
So,
find my own ground out of it. Yeah.
so you see a lot of room for alternative education systems at this time.
Yes, yes. So I actually went and studied, visited many places. For example, I visited Risi Valley School. It was started in 1935 by Krishnamurti. Uh,
Yes, I was going to bring that up actually. It's one of those last surviving, really different schools, very much part of the Indian ethos and suitable for the people who belong
yes,
to this civilizational culture, etc. I think of late, the Art of Living and the Isha Foundation have also done some work in the area, and of course, the Ramakrishna missions have continued
yes.
their work
With
as
their
well.
own schools. Yeah. So,
Right.
these schools are fantastic. Like so, Krishnamurti Foundation schools, schools which are following Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Uh, so Chinmaya Mission, they run their own schools. Amritanand Mahima in
Yes.
Kerala, so they have their own set of schools. So there are many organizations who have kind of come up and established their own set of schools with different philosophy than the state professors in India.
Right.
But I think one tragedy with these alternative schools have been that so they so even though they started with a very kind of distributive approach to begin with, but after some time they became very elitist. So, for example, in many schools, I don't want to name it, but so now if you go and visit them, you would see that only children from upper strata of the
I
society
understand.
they are studying there. So the whole character has changed, and also it is very difficult to replicate those models to elsewhere in India.
But
And those
I would suggest it's a little natural, right? Because after all, if it is privately funded, it's going to charity is always an unsustainable cause. So unless there is an actual community constantly donating and participating in the growth of these institutions, it's
yes.
going to end up being more and more expensive for students to
and
be
also we
part of
have to
that.
understand school as an organism. So school not so school is not just a property or a set of certain individuals where there are school teachers, principal, students, but it is whole organism which emerges out of a community or an environment, and that's why and this makes it very difficult for it to replicate itself elsewhere, right? So you can start a Krishnamurti Foundation school in Rishi Valley in a district in Andhra Pradesh or in Banaras, but it is very difficult to replicate that model elsewhere because you need the support from the community. It should emerge very naturally. Local communities should have a stake in it. So all of those issues are actually missing when you want to replicate that model elsewhere. Yeah.
Right.
So
So, I have a question about this model actually. What do you think about the possibility of, say, entrepreneurship or later job seeking availability or acceptability when people like I know that for students graduating from, say, Ramakrishna Mission schools or such places, it's quite normal for them, or Amritan, Mata Amritanandamai colleges. It's quite easy for them to get jobs. They have decent college placements. But typically, is there an issue with job placements or anything like that with such universities or education systems?
yeah, so for example, in the schooling system, certain compromises are made. For example, uh, parents they start demanding that they want to send their kids to IITs. So in many cases, parents have actually asked the school to kind of relieve their kids because they want to enroll their kids to some other school because they want to prepare them for IITs or medical seats, right? So and following that, many schools have also, for example, you have to take accreditation from either
Right.
CBSC, ICSE, these boards, and these boards have their own set of rules and regulations which you have to follow as an alternative school. So then a middle ground has to be found where you are trying to implement certain philosophies which are in a very fundamental conflict with what ICSC approaches or what CBSC approaches or what other state board approaches, right? So then lots of compromises are made, especially on pedagogical part, on curricular part, because at the same time you also want to mainstream your students. You don't want to, for example, you don't want to picture your school as okay. So they are creating some. So there is a chaos out there in those schools, and they're creating anarchists for the future, not the members of the
People who fit
society.
into society,
Yeah.
right?
So then many of these schools then start compromising on many of their values, many of their pedagogies and curriculum. So it is again very difficult to implement those models. So you have to be really really independent in order to do so. But now there are some mechanism through which you can actually, uh, for example, there is a system called NIOS, open and open schooling, where you can have such institutions, these places, and you can enroll your children into this NIOS system, where the children is learning through distance learning, but he or she can be placed in your institutions. So you then you can actually then uh, negotiate these ICSC, CBSC, and all state board models. So now I think spaces are emerging where you can actually work around it and work with these models. Let's see how this pans out in future.
Right. So you mentioned the pedagogical approaches and the policies themselves have, they're a little dissonant when it comes to real life scenarios. And if we look back to history, does, the impact of colonialism have anything to do with that?
Sure, sure. So for example, and also now, so when we talk about education, we have to understand that this whole concept of public education or publicly funded education is very very new. So somehow when it comes to discussing education, we feel that oh, these Western countries were always very advanced, and we somehow lagged these initiatives when it comes to education in India. It's not the case. Even in Britain, even in other European countries, public education or publicly funded education came as late as mid of 19th century, or early 19th century, right? And around that time only we had actually started implementing or kind of experimenting with those ideas. And also, so if you look at this whole model of schooling, especially the Western schooling, it was always attached with the expansion of Christianity. So, for example, in I think 1650 or 1695, there was a resolution passed in British Parliament that how education has to be used by these mercantile group who are expanding to other countries, other colonies, uh, as an expansion of Christianity itself. So education has to be used as, and you would see that how these European powers, imperial powers, whether it was Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, when they came to India, and when they established their colonies, the first thing they did was to open these schools, and for many years those schools were not uh, for the natives in India. So all the people who are working with the institutions, or those imperial powers, they were only allowed to have education. It was only kind of in the later 19th century they started expanding education to other, like for the native
So,
population.
so for the natives that they were looking to use as interlocutors between the locals and the British themselves, that's who the education was for. They would sort of have, exposure to Christian value systems and help learn the language and translate, so to speak, the local culture for the colonizers.
So first few schools which came up on the lines of Western education, they were these schools were opened in the colonies of, for example, in Goa, in
Hmm.
Chennai, these presidencies, and the first students to be admitted in those schools were where either the children of the for example, those missionaries or the converts. So non-religious group, for example, only co-religious were allowed in those schools, not other religion groups. It is only after, for example, when they started seeing that, okay, so now uh, missionaries can also use education as an evangelical tool, then they started including other religions also in their scheme of education.
Mhm.
So also the history is this history is also very interesting, and many of the things which were uh, discussed in those times, like in the late 18th centuries or early 19th centuries, you would see that how those issues are still very much relevant even now. For example, the issue of language and this whole Anglicist versus Orientalist debate in India. For example, Warren Hastings. So he was one of the like very vocal proponent of Orientalist education in India. He started Calcutta Madrasa. Uh, Also, Banaras Sanskrit College came up, uh, and all of these initial East India employees, they're very enamored by the local culture, and they wanted to participate in it. They wanted to know about it, and also they needed help. For example, they wanted some kind of law to govern all those areas they were operating from. So to come up with those laws, they wanted natives. For example, Persian was the language of official language those days. So in Mughal Darbar, Persian was the official language, and offshoot states which came out of when Mughal Sultanate disappeared. For example, Awadh, uh, in Ruhelkhand, in other places, even in Bengal. So even there, the Persian was the official language of the Darbar. Another language which was used in India for a very long time was Sanskrit. So they started translating these texts, available text, with the help of pandits, in in especially in case of Sanskrit, and then Maulvis in case of Persian.
Mhm.
So Asiatic Society came up in 1784. William Jones and these guys, they started translating many of Indian text into English with their own interpretation.
Mhm.
Uh, Very problematic that is, but but we can see that how that was the first kind of motivation to kind of read ancient text of India, whether it was in Persian language or in Sanskrit language. And from there, this whole debate between the Anglicist and Orientalist started. So in initial period, Orientalists dominated the scene. So because they were supported by uh, William like Hastings and other professors who came up and supported the idea of learning from the local cultures, and then kind of making suitable policies so that there is no controversy or not any resistance of British expansion in India or East India expansion in India. But at the same time, there were people like Charles Grant, and there is very interesting history of Charles Grant where he came to India first, and he earned a lot of money, but in Britain, somehow his wife, she got married to somebody else, and this guy got really disgruntled. He went back and he joined the church and he became an evangelist. So after like going back to England, he started kind of uh, arguing that why we need English education in India, and he started writing letters to all the MPs, to East India Company officials, to other parliamentarians, saying that we need education in English education in India, and that also through missionaries, and also for political reasons. East India Company had actually stayed away from involving missionaries in their expansion. So very, and it was a very strategic decision. Now Charles Grant, he started putting pressure on East India Company officials that you have to actually involve missionaries in expanding education in India. So then came the 1813 Act, which kind of first provided rupees 1 lakh for the expansion of Orientalist education in India. But at the same time, it allowed missionaries to have their own operations, that have their own schools in India. So after that, you can see that many missionaries from Scotland, from Ireland, from many other places coming to
Yes.
India and establishing their own schools. So and this was not that it went unchallenged. So there were locals, like both communities, from Muslim community and Hindu communities as well, especially traditionalists, who opposed this whole Western concept of education, or English as a medium of education. But at the same time, there were also individuals like Raja Ram Mohan Rai who actually welcomed the decision of having education in English medium. So, and I think this was the period from 1820s to 1850s that kind of decided the future of education in India as well. So if you will look at the history, and also there were people like Raj Kamal Sen, uh, so who were in kind of regular correspondence with William Jones and many other such individuals who opposed William Bentinck and Macaulay as well. And somehow we feel that 1835 policy of Lord Macaulay, it settled the education debate in India, but it was not the case. So if we look at the educational history, we would see that how 1836, uh, so when Lord William Bentinck, he went back to England, and I think the next viceroy or governor general who came to India, he had to actually come up with a compromise where he allowed traditionalists to have their own system of education, but at the same time expanding the scope of English education in India, and that you would see playing out even after 1857 war. So we can somehow conceptualize it in the terms of how there was this dialogue happening between the traditionalists of India and the reformist of India among them, and the Orientalist and Anglicist of the East India Company. And these dialogues, these conversations were going at the same time. And
So it wasn't as consolidated as we are made to think, especially with the idea of Macaulay's children and things like that. It was simply not that straightforward.
yeah, it was not straightforward.
So we
So
had several groups pursuing their individual community linguistic education in their own systems, and then we had those that would work for the civil services and the British themselves. So I suppose after a while, this is just a question. After a while, do you think that the those that were working for the British, those became the elites and were able to consolidate the education system under them, and so the Anglicization became more popular? Was that the case? So, did we see the effects more post independence? Were they more visible at that time rather than pre-independence? I'm seeing that there's so much dialogue and so much chaos literally happening across borders.
yeah, so we can see the impact of it. For example, uh, so many elites from these communities, and also there was this competitive politics where these communities were engaging in. So many of the elites from Hindu community, for example, Brahmins, they got themselves educated in an English education, and one of the primary reason for getting educated in English medium or in schools run by missionaries and the British government was that you going to get jobs with the British government, and it was also considered a very stable job, and they were expanding for the expansion of railway. So they also created Indian civil services, uh, and they also needed Indians in managerial positions,
Mm.
especially to interact with the laborers working in many places. And also many initiatives, local initiatives were started. And also around 1830, you would also see that there was this expansion of community schools. So many communities came forward. For example, Gujarati communities in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, Parsi community in Mumbai, in West Bengal, or in Bengal, many communities, especially Hindu communities and Muslim communities, they started their own schools. And after 1840s, there was this whole campaign towards we should also have girls in school. So one of the first schools for the girls to be started was in 1840s. So these were the parallel system, but at the same time, English education became very very popular because it was a way, or easier way to get government jobs in institutions of British government. Also, you can qualify for the ICS, if and also you would have much better position in society if you are educated in English. And also there were many positions opening up because British Army was also expanding. So you also need to know a little bit of English in order to talk to your superiors in British Army. So there, and also uh, British, mainly British officials, along with Indians, they started opening their own business initiatives. And even for that, you need individuals who know local language as well as
Hmm.
knowledge of English. So that this role of intermediary between the natives and British became very very important, and that we can see playing out even post independence. Yeah.
All right. Excuse me. What's dispatch is supposed to be the, final nail in terms of the adoption of English education in India. So, do you want to discuss that? I also want to make this very fascinating point that I came across when Macaulay, he himself spoke several languages. He spoke a lot of European languages. Did not see fit to learn a single Indian language because he thought that native education was worth less than a single bookshelf in a European library. But he was obsessed with Greek and Roman classics, as well as autodidact who taught himself several other languages, Spanish,
Yes.
French, etc.
So, so
Excuse me.
so this is a very interesting question, and to answer that, so we have to actually look at the background of Macaulay, Lord Macaulay. So actually he was a utilitarian, and as a utilitarian, he felt that English as a modern language was much more useful because all the utilitarian they emphasize on utility of something, right? So he found that how, especially in the modern times, English is as a modern language is much useful than Arabic or Sanskrit, uh, and and also because of being an imperialist, he felt that English as a language it occupies a predominant position across all the languages, and also in India it was the language of the ruling class. So British, it was their language, and and for and further the chances of it becoming the language of commerce through the seas of east were very very bright. For example, English were also uh, kind of in uh, so they had established several ports. Singapore was one of the port, Hong Kong was one of the port. So there, and also they were trading with many other European powers. So he felt that if even Indians know the language, they can become integral part of this whole global economy. Uh, and also, he was supported by many Indians, like uh, uh, who thought that uh, if Indians are willing to taught in English, then there is no harm in teaching them English. So, for example, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, he was a big supporter of English education in India,
Right.
and and by that time, because of many missionary schools, there were natives who were really really good in English. For example, Raja Ram Mohan Rai was really really good in English. So so this belief also got supported by some of these natives who became really good in English, became a really, really good scholar in English. So somehow Macaulay believed that we can actually create great scholars in English
But they
as.
were also impediments to the independence movement as such, right? The Brahmo Samaj, formerly the Brahmo Sabha, that Raja Ram Mohan Roy did co-found. So they were those who wanted, the interlocutor elitist status under the colony of the English. They weren't particularly instrumental or even favored the idea of Indian independence or sovereignty at all.
Yeah, so I think even this whole idea of sovereignty, it comes very very late, only in like in the beginning of 20th century, and even then we would see these cries of.
I would like to argue that, though. I mean, it's not because even the Marathas and of that, even Shivaji Maharaj is known to have spoken about the invasions and the fact that he wanted all of India united again under the Maratha Empire. And this was carried forward by several of his, even though the empire itself was declining, it was carried forward by his descendants as well. But yeah, when it comes to the British, we do tend to overestimate the time that they spent here. So they do not
Yes.
spend as much time. So yeah, I suppose while the empire was in decline, that's when, the thought of independence came through. So yeah.
And we also have to like realize that even these British, they were in constant negotiation with the
Right.
natives, so it was not an easy journey for them also. So at the same time they were negotiating with many of these princely states in India. There were so many princely states in India, and some of those states were doing really really well when it
Yeah.
comes to education. For example, Mysore, Vadodara,
Baroda, yeah.
yeah. So these states were actually doing, and there were some really good kings in or maharajas in these states who
Bikaner.
were all, yeah. So 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 this was a kind of constant negotiation happening, uh, and kind of even internal dialogue. And also we cannot separate Indian politics from the British politics.
Right.
So even there in British Parliament, these issues were being raised, that how do we want to actually govern in India, and 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 for example, and we see a lot of hypocrisy here, especially when it comes to governing India, even from the people like James Stuart Mill. So even though Mill talked about liberty, like his one of most popular book is Liberty,
Yeah.
but he somehow saw that how Indians as brown people were different from the whites. So,
He also spoke about women like that, so it's just the white men from
and
his
white
community.
women. So
uh,
very interesting that even though he was very very sympathetic towards the rights of women, but for him women meant the white women. So, so the human rights of white men he was concerned with, the white women he was concerned with. So, and this you can also see reflecting in all the parliamentary policies which flowed through parliament in India. So, even education policies. So these were the instruments. For example, education, law, and
But I
religion.
would also suggest that it helped them to maintain status quo because the mercantile systems, when it translated to the actual colonizing by the British state, also allowed all of their officers to maintain brothels and harems at literally no cost. Right? They could use impoverished women, and there are so many records of. Them being used as sex slaves, literally. So, educating these people would definitely not allow them to have that sort of maintain that status quo at all. So, I
Yeah,
suppose they could restrict it to the elites of India as well and cultivate the same system, same British system for them, and have them reap some of those benefits.
yeah. So, but if we read some statements which, so let me just read out some statements. So I have actually, uh, yeah. So
Do you want to share your screen, or will you just read it out?
so I can also share my screen. But for example, so more than uh, Lord Macaulay, it was George uh, Trevelyan, and George Trevelyan was Macaulay's, I think. Uh, one of the relatives, and he talked about actually his approach to education, which actually influenced Macaulay's approach. And let me quote him on education. So he argues that yeah. So it would be so, and I'm quoting him, and this is George Trevelyan's testimony before Parliament, and he's suggesting that India might join Canada and Australia in following the United States down the path to political independence while maintaining close cultural and economic ties to Britain. So he was like somehow Macaulay and others were thinking that if we expand English education in India, then we would be able to create, and he also expressed the belief that as the English language spreads across India and indeed the entire globe, so will our learning, our morals, our principles of constitutional liberty, and our religion. And he was also like seeing a liberal dream for India, and he hinted in his book that the spread of English might one day lead to a desire for English political institutions in India, as well as the parliamentary system. So, like his
Well, it's been
words,
achieved. They can be
yeah,
proud. It's been achieved.
yeah. So prophetic, so much
Right.
prophetic words. So,
But
so all of
it's very interesting that you say that. It's the exact same argument that today's neo-imperialists and the U.S. government, as U.S. state at this time, uses in terms of exploiting other nations or militarily affecting or politically affecting other nations as well. That now this they use education, and now currently others use media. So we've got all of the color revolutions backed by a lot of media coverage that was favorable to the US. So I think it's very interesting that the arguments for imperialism remain exactly the same, one
exactly
by
the same.
education, one by
Yeah.
another information distribution
So,
system.
and very interestingly, even though they were arguing for English education in India to create intermediate class, but at the same time they were aware of their own racial moral superiority.
Right.
So, so for example, so there was one Englishman called J. Faris. So he was a member of Bombay government, and 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 this is what he writes in a letter. In his letter in 1838. So, and I'm quoting him. This is quote from his letter. He says, "The natives of India must be kept down by a sense of our power, and they must willingly submit from a conviction that we are wiser, more just, and more human to improve their conditions." And he further writes, if well directed, the progress of education would undoubtedly increase our moral hold over India. But at the same time, we should also ensuring that it does not lead the natives to a consciousness of their own strength. So just look
Wow.
at these.
Well,
Yeah,
at least they recognize that there is some strength, which I will just suggest that a lot of their descendants, in terms of Indians themselves, don't seem to buy
yes,
into. They actually believe the first part without acknowledging the second part at all. So it's very interesting that they succeeded so absolutely and completely in this endeavor.
yeah. So actually, also from this moral superiority, and they used knowledge to internalize this oppression. And this is in sociological term, this is called hegemony. So once you
Absolutely.
create hegemony, the oppressed they themselves start believing that this violence was good for them,
Right.
and many Indians would say that how colonialism was very good for them. So they
Right.
created institutions, they created they gave us democracy, they gave us railways. There would be so many
Yeah, yeah,
arguments to support which is like colonialism in India, but we don't actually realize that these were the tools to actually rule over us, to oppress us, to victimize us. So very interesting, and Britishers were very like, clear about this approach, that even though
yeah.
we want to, and
So I'd
and
love for your views on the psychology of this sort of colonial imposition of education on our next chat. I'd love to discuss how the
yes,
psychology of colonialism has worked across other countries as well.
yeah.
Um,
So very interesting. So there is some really interesting work by an African, a Kenyan author, uh, and his book is very popular, Decolonizing the Mind. So
right.
I can use that book, and there he talks about how education was used as a tool to oppress African languages and African people as well, and very interesting conversation happening. And then so we also have psychoanalyst talking about how education had psychological impact, what kind of psychological impact education had on the natives when they start believing that uh, how this whole colonialism, imperialism was a good exercise for them. So we can definitely discuss this in our next conversation.
All right. Well, it's been an absolutely fascinating talk, Anurag, and I certainly look forward to our next one. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I
Thank
look
you,
forward
sir.
to meeting you
Thank
soon.
you so much for
Thank
calling.
you.
Yeah, thank you.